Welcome to episode 62 of the How to Japanese podcast. I'm Daniel Morales from howtojapanese.com, and it's March 2025. We made it. Otsukare-sama deshita. This episode comes a little bit later in the month than usual, so I've got a good bit to talk about. I'll be covering my newsletter, my longer than usual blog post, and some notes about getting married in Japan. Yes, I spent a couple weeks at the end of February and the start of this month getting married. So I was pretty busy. I had family visiting. My wife's family was in town, and we had to deal with everything about the ceremony and the reception afterwards. Fortunately, it all went really well, kind of exceptionally well, to be honest. It happened so quickly that it feels kind of like a strange, extremely fun bump in the road that's now behind us, which is a little depressing. So maybe this writing and the podcasting I'm doing this month is an attempt to kind of capture that and put it into some slightly more permanent form, even if it's really just a temporary form. And this month's newsletter is actually partially inspired by something that happened while my family was visiting. And that something was a simple taxi ride. Because we did so much traveling around Osaka and Kyoto, we ended up taking taxis more than I usually do. I mostly rely on public transportation here in Osaka, and I also did so in Chicago. And also in Tokyo when I lived there. New Orleans is the only place that I've lived in the last 20 years or so where I wasn't really able, actually that's not totally true. I wasn't able to use it in New Orleans, but also in Fukushima where I was relying on cars. But whenever I have had access to an urban transportation network, I've basically been relying on that. But our group was so big and had so many small children, and I'm starting to age myself. I realized that taxi rides made a lot of sense, kind of cutting out a lot of the effort and the time involved. The costs that you can save in money using public transportation often aren't made up for what you lose trying to really just huff it. And also, when you get enough people in a single taxi ride, the costs come down per person a great bit. Especially if you're using Uber, which is what we were mostly relying on. It's tied into the Osaka taxi system. There do seem to be regular cars available as there are in the US, but they are a separate category, and there are so few of them that they take longer than the regular taxis, and the cost benefit was marginal. And in this case, though, this story that inspired the newsletter this month was just a regular taxi. So we were mostly using Uber, but in this case, we were in the Parco in Shinsaibashi. Parco is a department store, and Shinsaibashi, one of the more fashionable neighborhoods in Osaka. And we got in the cab right on Midosuji, a major avenue here in Osaka. And I found that over the course of 2 weeks, riding with, lots of foreigners in cabs, often loud foreigners, the drivers either ended up being very talkative or completely silent. And in this case, this one particular driver was pretty talkative. Don't remember exactly what started the conversation other than every conversation I had with a taxi driver or an Uber driver was always started with the destination, which was my parents' hotel. It has a kind of long, strange name that wasn't immediately recognizable to most drivers. It's a pretty big hotel, but it's not a major brand. And the drivers didn't immediately recognize it. But the neighborhood they immediately recognized. And I was able to describe exactly where it was based on the nearby station and the things near that station. No major landmarks, but just a grocery store right there across from the hotel. And that immediately kind of cued all of them. And in this case, this driver, I think probably the conversation just continued naturally from there. And we ended up just talking and even finding out that he's got a daughter who married an American from Chicago, which was kind of a strange twist of fate. But I finally was able to ask this driver a question that had kind of been hovering in the back of my mind, just out of reach of being able to kind of like act on it and ask someone or Google it or something. until that moment. And the question I asked him was, why are there so many suji in Osaka? I think one thing about moving to a new location is you start to notice this new set of vocabulary, in particular, the kind of geographical vocabulary of the city. And when I moved here in 2022, that was one thing that kind of threw me for a moment, seeing all these new place names that were very unfamiliar felt like, even though they're kanji that I recognized, putting them all together, having them kind of coalesce into actual locations, into pronounceable words, took a minute, and that was kind of an interesting experience. And one of those words that you see often is suji, which is the Japanese word for tendon, but also clearly some kind of like other meaning that I wasn't quite sure of at first. So suji also is the kin in kinniku, I believe, and so muscle, the word for muscle. And so I had kind of gotten this sense of suji. Also, it's used at the end of all these Mido Suji, right? This major avenue. Tenjinbashi Suji is another long road in Osaka. Also, Sakai Suji is the name of a road, but also a subway line here in Osaka, the subway line that runs along that road. And so I had gotten this sense of it, but this taxi driver gave me a much more detailed explanation, which is that suji are the major avenues running north to south. And that like kind of immediately was a naruhodo moment for me. It clicked, and I was like, aha, that makes so much sense. And tori, he said, are the streets running east to west. Osaka is much more of a grid-based city than Tokyo. It does break down in places, notably in Nakazaki-cho, which I'll mention later actually in the podcast, a neighborhood right between Tenjinbashi Suji kind of and Umeda, the Osaka station area. But the grid holds for the core of the city, especially some of the larger, more important thoroughfares. And the streets, Suji, Tori Suji kind of crosshash city is a really interesting way to think about it. The streets you might have heard of are streets like Chuo-dori, which features a major expressway, and the Senba Center building, which is a long set of buildings divided by a few of these north to south avenues. And these buildings have like used bookstores, a bunch of used bookstores, and apparently some kimono shops, which also will come up later in the podcast. Another one is Nagahori-dori, a major transportation intersection near Shinsaibashi. And then Honmachi-dori, which is just north of Chuo-dori and is kind of a central business district. But getting back to suji, it's a super interesting word with a huge variety of meanings. The kanji itself has an interesting etymology. The kanji is bamboo along the top, and then underneath that, moon, which symbolizes meat on the left. And I'm sure that it's not actually, I'm sure somebody can correct me there, that it's not actually moon, but it's written in the same form as tsuki, or maybe it does mean moon. Somebody set me straight either way. And that's on the left, and then on the right, chikara for strength. And if I'm reading this online etymology that I found correctly, it initially meant powerful arms, and then came to mean the strength running through muscles, and then to mean tendon or sinew running through the literal muscles. And strangely enough, Osakans and Western Japanese in general are much more likely to put gyusuji being beef tendon, in their oden, based on an article I found, which I'll link in either the blog post or the newsletter. But oden, if you're not familiar, is this delicious simmered broth in Japan, and you can find it all over the place anywhere really, in convenience stores even. And they have a giant tub of this broth with things like boiled eggs, daikon, chikua, tofu, konjac, all sorts of kind of root vegetables, different types of potatoes and things like that that just kind of sit there at this nice warm simmering temperature, and you can have them pick a few items out and they'll fill up a nice little bucket of broth for you. You can go home and eat those, or you get it out at a standing bar. You often see tashinomi oden places, and also just other random restaurants will sometimes have it. But gyu suji is beef tendon, right, as I mentioned, and it's one of these items that can get included. And this article that I'm looking at did a survey of households in Japan in 2023, and the spectrum is remarkable, right? Usually surveys, right, I think people are hesitant to trust them, but it's so striking that I feel like there must be some truth to this. The map that I'm looking at, it has a shade, and it asks households where the gyusuji fit on their ranking of oden items, I guess. And the prefectures are listed from 1st to 47th, and the ones that were most likely to use gyusuji in their oden are bright red, and the ones least likely to use gyusuji in their oden are this dramatic green color. And the hotspot is Yamaguchi Prefecture, right, in Western Japan. And it's bright red. Hiroshima is orange. Okayama, bright red. Hyogo is kind of yellow. Osaka, orange. Wakayama, bright red. Ehime, kind of a dark orange color. Oita, dark orange. Miyazaki, Kagoshima are yellow. And then you start moving back towards Eastern Japan, and you see Shiga is orange, but then we have Aichi is kind of yellow-green, Shizuoka, yellow-green, Gifu, slightly darker green, Nagano, dark green, Yamanashi, very dark green, Saitama, dark green, and all of Tohoku is a shade of green, and Hokkaido, deep green. And so it's incredible to me that this contrast exists so starkly, and how it's very interesting. So that was just a little interesting factoid that I found. I wasn't sure whether gyusuji were an Osaka thing or not, because I see it here all the time, and the ones I do see are fairly intense looking. The one that I'm thinking of in particular is at a kushikatsu place that I like on the Tenjinbashi Suji Shotengai. And one of the best parts of this kushikatsu place is that your first beer is 100 yen, or your first highball for 100 yen. Can't beat that. Like, what, 75 cents, 65 cents? Like, unbeatable. They've got a giant tub of oden in addition to the kushikatsu that they fry up. And they've got a regular set of oden, this regular kind of tray of like daikon and eggs and tofu and things like that. But they've got one for gyusuji that's separate and has this like really viscous, I don't know, maybe miso or bone broth. I'm not sure, but it's very thick and opaque as opposed to the oden broth, which I imagine is a kind of basic dashi broth. I haven't been adventurous enough to try it yet, but maybe this is my sign. I'm not really big into nankotsu or things like that at yakitori, or every now and then I'll do a kushikatsu, nankotsu, the fried, what is it? I always forget the difference between tendon and ligaments, but one of those two, or cartilage being, I think cartilage is nankotsu. But so it's kind of been in that area of food items for me where it's still a little bit outside my comfort zone, gyusuji. But I guess I should probably give them a shot. They are a recommendation at this kushikatsu spot that I go to. So this is very literally the suji, one meaning of suji. And as I was looking into the dictionary definitions for this month, there's a huge range of meaning for the word suji. And I'll go through them quickly. I list these up in the newsletter. There's 18 of them, and I include a link to the dictionary where I found this. But the first is muscle or muscle fibers. Second is tendon. Third is blood vessels that visibly show above the surface of the skin, apparently. Fourth is plant fibers. The fifth is a long, narrow chain of things. The sixth is a striped pattern. 7 is a family lineage. 8 is a school of art or study. 9 is aptitude or talent. 10 means the logic of things. I think the phrase you see there often is suji ga totteru or something like that. So literally the suji connects through or communicates through, goes through, something like that. 11 is the plot / summary of a novel / play. So some kind of fictional work. And one word you see there often is arasuji. And I assume that suji is derived from this suji. Arasuji being the word for plot. 12 is an area related to that thing. I need some help kind of understanding this one, but the Japanese phrase that they use is sono koto ni kankei no aru homen. Sono koto ni kankei no aru homen. And the example sentence in the dictionary is tashika na suji kara no jouho. Tashika na suji kara no jouho, which makes it sound like some kind of source of information. So sono koto ni kankei no aru homen, something in that direction. Something from a specific direction. Not sure. The next definition, number 13, is something one wants to request. 14 is the area along a road or a river. 15 is in go or shogi, the play considered the proper move. I may need a little help here as well, although I did find a site that has a bunch of information in English about, actually in Romaji, about shogi terms. A pretty interesting site, and there's a couple spots where suji gets included. 16 is also shogi related, and it's on a shogi board. Either of the 2 vertical 9 rows, apparently. So I am totally unfamiliar with shogi, but it sounds like maybe the rows are numbered, or the columns are numbered, and the number 9 ones are called suji. 17 is social standing or position. And 18, suji can be an abbreviation of suji kamaboko, so some kind of fish paste, right? So thinking about all these meanings collectively, the core meaning I think is pretty clear, and it all kind of derives literally from this meaning tendon, this something that runs through something else, a long connected thing that ties something together. And from this literal meaning, you get all these very interesting figurative meanings and also associative meanings, things that are either associated with something long and connected through, like a tendon, so something on a shogi board, or the area along a road or a river, or the figurative, right? So it can be used to describe something logical, so suji ga totteru, or the family lineage, or even the plot to a work of fiction, right? Something that runs through it. That I thought that was super interesting, and I don't know. There's probably up there in terms of words that do a lot of work. Suji is probably up there. So next time you're in Osaka, keep an eye out for some of our famous suji. And let me be the first to recommend Tenjinbashi Suji, which has what was the longest shotengai in Japan until Tokyo came along recently and made one that was maybe just slightly longer or something like that. But I don't even know which one it is, but the few photos I saw of it when it went up looked incredibly shiny and glossy and brand new, which I think defeats at least half the purpose of a great shotengai, which is that it's rusty and plain and well worn, and maybe not totally rusty, but like well used, like so much in Japan. So many great, wonderful municipal buildings that are used forever, politely and taken care of. I mentioned Shotengai briefly back in the March 2024 episode of the podcast. And this is the Shotengai. This Tenjinbashi Suji Shotengai has the kushikatsu spot I mentioned previously. This is the one where I came to understand kakuhai as a word that had kind of developed in the culture. That's what I wrote about in March 2024, so a year ago. And here I am a year later talking about this same Shotengai, talking about Haiboru again. But that's not the only reason I would go to Tenjinbashi Suji Shotengai. Going there to get some good kushikatsu is a perfectly good reason to go there, but it's got a great used bookstore. It has just a wonderful Japanese neighborhood vibe. And that's kind of what I wrote about on the blog this month. I did a big set of recommendations, which I'm sure I've done at some point since 2008. But the one post that I always really remember is when I moved to Tokyo from Fukushima, and was kind of so excited about that move that I was inspired to share some random recommendations as I was experiencing them. And so this time around, I just hosted family in Osaka. So I've got a lot of thoughts. So I'll go through some of those from the blog real quick. And I think the first point might be the most controversial point, which is, at this point in my life, I think I'd rather have 50,000 yen in taxi rides than 50,000 yen in Shinkansen tickets, to be honest. And the reason I put this price tag on there is because that's the current price of the Japan Rail Pass. It went up pretty dramatically a couple years ago from 30,000 yen, which was a complete steal. At that cost, you could cover one round trip ticket from Tokyo to Kyoto, and then like one additional ride somewhere, like one additional day trip, and you've covered the cost of the entire rail pass. At 50,000 yen, you've got to do a bit more traveling than that. You have to do round trip Tokyo to Kyoto, but then you also have to do like Hiroshima, maybe go to Fukuoka, go from there down to somewhere to Nagasaki, go to Kagoshima or something like that to really get a lot of value out of it. And you have to do all of that within a week, which means likely traveling every day, which is going to get exhausting. And are you really that interested in covering ground at the cost of not seeing everything where you're going? I would say that's really the kind of trade-off. Some might say that the rail pass is just convenient and you don't have to think about it, but at the same time, the Hikari trains, the ones that you're able to ride with the rail pass, aren't quite as convenient as they used to be. The Nozomi trains are just so frequent these days that being able to ride them is a benefit that you don't get. And then the rail pass, it's great within, I would say, the Tokyo area because the JR goes everywhere. It's extremely well connected. You can take a lot of JRs to get around and avoid the subway, and you're making up a little bit of the cost there, even though I'd say it's not that much of a cost. To be honest, these riding the basic JR fares around Tokyo are not all that expensive, but it's not quite as helpful if you're in the Kansai area. The JR is a bit more limited. You want to be riding the Keihan and the Hankyu lines, for example, to get to Kyoto all often because they're going to put you right in the middle of Kawaramachi or a short walk from Kiyomizu-dera or near Gion, places like that, rather than JR Kyoto Station, which is maybe convenient for Fushimi Inari to a certain extent, but not quite the rest of the city, especially anywhere to the north, the core part of the city. So yeah, my recommendation would be to book one round trip Shinkansen ticket to somewhere, whether that's going to be, if you're in Tokyo, is that going to be Sendai or Kyoto? Or if you fly into Kyoto and Osaka, is that going to be to Hiroshima or Fukuoka, somewhere like that? Or you could even just book a plane ticket, to be honest. A round trip plane ticket is going to cost you potentially less than a round trip Shinkansen ticket. And then you can put all the savings, whatever you save, up towards that 50,000 yen that you would spend on a JR pass and use that on taxis. My body at 43 years old is starting to fail me, and having 10 to 15 minutes to sit and save time between two tourist sites is a godsend when you're out and about. As I mentioned above, my other recommendation on the blog is using Uber. There seem to be a lot of promotions available, which reminds me of when Uber first started in the US. That it was extremely cheap. It was being subsidized to kind of get lure people into the system. There are a lot of promotions going, and so I would say most of our rides were either 75 or 35% off. It seems like if you use it a little and then stop using it for a while, they'll try and the promotions will come back, and they'll try and lure you back in with some of these promotions. So I can recommend that. The only inconveniences were that some areas are roped off, and you need to kind of get a pickup outside of the areas. You do that near Kiyomizu. And some of the Osaka side streets are just really hard for the taxis to access. And so you have to kind of find a spot that's a little bit more convenient, but it was never that much trouble. The other recommendation I make in Osaka is if you're flying through Itami Airport, a taxi ride might seem a little pricey at first, but it's really not terrible. You can, if you're with 2 or 3 people, getting a taxi or an Uber is probably going to end up at 2,000 or 3,000 yen per person, which is a lot more than the probably no more than 1,000 yen it would cost to ride a bus or the subway, or a bus and subway, depending on where you're trying to go. But it's also going to save you a good bit of time, a little bit of effort if you're with your luggage. If you're really not fussed, the limousine bus is definitely my recommendation, getting that to Osaka Station and then figuring it out the rest of the way. Unless you're going somewhere really far south of Osaka Station for some reason, or if you're going somewhere else that's inconvenient to access from Osaka Station. That would be my bit. And also I would recommend that from KIX as well. The KIX Osaka Station limousine bus is extremely convenient. Overall, Osaka, great place to visit, excellent place to be a tourist. We do have our fair share of tourists, but it doesn't feel bombarded like Tokyo and Kyoto do right now, except for a few of the main tourist districts, notably Dotonbori, Shinsekai, and Umeda. Most of the other neighborhoods are super easy to get around and really nice to visit, not too many lines, easy to get in. It is difficult to know what to recommend to people here. We do have Osaka Castle and Dotonbori, but Osaka Castle is a bit of a buzzkill. Not buzzkill, what's the right word? It's a bit of a letdown, I would say, especially if you've been to Himeji or any of the castles that are authentic and not rebuilds. And Dotonbori is fine, but very brandy these days as far as shopping goes. So Osaka, while we don't have the same kind of awe factor, we do have excellent like little neighborhoods with just tons and tons of restaurants. And I think that's what surprised my family the most, was like just the sheer number of restaurants in Osaka blew them away. How would you ever have time to try even a small portion of them? I have no idea. And so many of them are incredible. So if you like good food, if you have a discerning eye for kind of weathered urban Japan, come see us in Osaka. In the newsletter, I call Osaka a matte finish city, which feels appropriate, especially compared to the kind of glossy finish of Tokyo, and the lacquer finish of Kyoto is what I call it. Obviously, Tokyo has its fair share of this matte finish. So does Kyoto. Japan in general, I would say, it's a matte finish country more than anything, even though it has a kind of glossy finish reputation. But if you appreciate a good matte finish, come see us in Osaka. As I mentioned, I recommended Tenjinbashi Suji Shotengai above. It is the best and most underrated neighborhood in Osaka. I put my parents at a hotel near the shopping arcade because I knew they would have a great time there. I knew it would be easy for them to find things to do without my help. They found wonderful coffee shops, places to buy souvenirs, tea shops, restaurants. So did my brothers, all of them on their own, lugging kids around, things like that. Super easy. I was there on a random Tuesday weekday in the middle of the day, and it was very interesting to see the neighborhood at that time because I was mostly visiting on the weekends because I don't live near that neighborhood anymore, or I would go on weekday evenings because it's walkable from my office. And I knew what the character of the neighborhood around then, but even on a random Tuesday, there was a steady stream of people walking up and down, not tourists, just people, maybe changing from the subway line to the JR or vice versa. There's tons of great places to see. There's the shrine, Osaka Tenmangu, which is nice. And the area, especially around JR Tenma Station, is probably the best vibes, I think, in almost all of Japan right now. It feels a bit like something like Shimbashi area in Tokyo, Yurakucho area, but so kind of it has that like under the tracks vibe. Not quite as, but it's a little bit maybe denser in places and not quite as overwhelming. It's got, hormon, nabe, kushikatsu, wine bars, craft beer pubs, back alley, takoyaki. It really has everything. And so put that on your radar next time you go to Osaka. Get off at JR Tenma Station and just kind of walk around that neighborhood, walk up and down the Shotengai and enjoy it. Right near there is this neighborhood called Nakazaki-cho, which is a curious little neighborhood. It's near the northern kind of end of Tenjinbashi Suji Shotengai. There's the Nakazaki-cho Shotengai that runs east to west. So Tenjinbashi Suji runs north-south, Nakazaki-cho Shotengai runs east to west, and they intersect. And if you walk all the way to the western end of that Shotengai, you end up in the Nakazaki-cho neighborhood, where the grid kind of breaks down. And it becomes this really interesting, curious little neighborhood where lots of like art galleries and cafes and boutiques, izakaya, antique stores, used clothing shops are kind of interspersed all throughout the neighborhood. And the strange part is that it doesn't really feel over touristed, but it does feel like it should be more touristy than it is. I couldn't quite tell if everyone there, I didn't see like huge numbers of tourists. And there were a lot of people, but I feel like there were a lot of Japanese there too. One of my brothers stayed in an Airbnb in that neighborhood and had a great time exploring, and made it pretty easy. It was pretty easy to find things to see and do. And personally, I would prefer to stay kind of closer towards Tenjinbashi Suji. If I was a tourist, I would want to be near that Shotengai area and that vibe. But if you prefer something more like kind of Brooklyn-y, Shimokitazawa feeling, Nakazaki-cho, I think, would be a good neighborhood to check out. And then I've got two other little kind of random one-off recommendations, and they both revolve around my parents forgetting their wedding suits. So they had their suits in a hanging bag. My dad had his suit in a hanging bag. My mom had her dress in it, and my dad forgot it. And they realized it when they got to the airport, but didn't have time to go back and grab it. Fortunately, it's really easy to have a suit made in Japan, and you don't even have to get it made. They'll find a jacket that fits you, and then they'll just hem pants in your size that fit you, and you're gonna look fine with something off the rack like that. It's not gonna be a perfect fit, obviously, but it'll look nice enough. And I would say the maximum you need to be paying is about 60,000 yen, which feels steeper in Japanese yen than it does in dollars at the moment. There are probably more affordable options to be had at places like Yofuku no Aoyama. We went to Suit Select, which was very nice. Even Uniqlo, I think, would probably have a good solution if you needed something, formal enough to get by. And I just don't think my dad would have looked right in something from Uniqlo, if that makes sense. Somebody who's like 70 years old, older than 70. But yeah, we had a suit for him within an hour, and that was easy enough. My mom was the other challenge, but in an insane whatever, I don't know what I did to deserve this, but I literally just Googled, I don't know, dresses or something. I don't remember what I Googled around their hotel, and this place popped up called Kimono Saisei Kojo. Kimono Saisei Kojo. So that's Kimono Reuse Factory. This is a small company that takes old kimono and repurposes them into dresses. Their main location is in Tokyo, but they have a really small Osaka branch that happens to be literally 3 blocks from where my parents were staying. So 5 minutes or less of a walk. And I emailed them and set up a time to go, and knew, because I had emailed with them, I knew exactly when they would have their options. They said they wouldn't have that many options, but they were getting a few in from Tokyo that day. And so we went, and my mom tried on 2 of them, thought it through, picked up one of them, and then it was great. She liked it. She liked it so much she wanted to buy it, but they said they couldn't sell it, but that they could make her one. And so she's extremely interested in doing that at some point. So I may be combing the Senba Center building for a used kimono that we can use for that. It's a good bit more expensive. The rentals were actually only 20,000 yen, which seems pretty reasonable. And it was all just very like, oh yeah, bring it back tomorrow, day after, whenever. Very kind of laissez-faire, and very interesting little business. So I would recommend checking that out, even if you're just interested in a special dress for a random special occasion. But that, and kind of finding a place to get my mom's hair done, which I literally just called the closest salon to the shrine and said, hey, can my mom get her hair blow dried right the morning of the wedding? And I called like a day or 2 before, and it was pretty easy to set up. So we got extremely lucky there. So that was my blog post. Those are my blog post recommendations. And then I was going to share one other little wedding-related story that may be instructive, or at least interesting, for the podcast. And this story starts back in 2008, actually, which is the first time I had this heart arrhythmia that I have called SVT, which means supraventricular tachycardia. This is a mostly harmless heart arrhythmia that basically results from a malfunction in the electrical current in your heart. And so the electrical current goes through your heart in a path that is abnormal. And the result of that is that it ends up beating at like 180 beats a minute. And it feels very strange to me. When you breathe normally, you can kind of feel how your breath and your heartbeat are interconnected. And if you breathe out for a long period of time, your heart begins to slow down, for example. And then if you start breathing really quickly, right, your heart rate starts to increase. I think probably because your body detects that it needs more oxygen, so it starts to beat so it can get more oxygen to you. When I go into SVT, those two become severed and are not related at all. So I can breathe extremely deeply, and my heart is continuing to beat at 180 beats a minute. It's very weird. I don't get lightheaded. I know some people do. For me, it generally only lasts, 5 to 15 minutes or so. The first time it happened to me, I was in a swimming pool in Tokyo doing laps, and I could feel it was something weird was happening. So I just kind of sat on the edge of the pool trying to figure out what was going on, waiting for it to subside, and then finish my laps. Fortunately, some of my family is in the medical field, and I was able to kind of talk with them and realize that it runs a little bit in the family, so it must be genetic or something. And so some of my family have dealt with it, and there are a few ways to kind of get yourself out of this rhythm. the one of the main ways they say is bearing down, like you're going to have a bowel movement, or splashing cold water on your face. Neither of these work really well for me. I find that lying on the ground with my feet up, like on a couch or something, will knock it out pretty quickly, as long as I'm like reasonably hydrated and not over caffeinated. But the only cure is something called a heart ablation, where they zap muscles in your heart to kill them and prevent current from running the wrong way. So you'd zap the areas where you don't want the electrical current to run. But my case has never really been that extreme. I've talked about doing that, but it seems like a little bit of overkill. And I find that I really only go into it if I'm dehydrated or over-caffeinated or tired. Last summer, I was having episodes basically anytime I tried to go running outside, I think, because it was so hot, and at other times as well. So I cut caffeine out of my daily habits, and I'm mostly still caffeine free, to be honest. And I try and stay hydrated as best I can. That generally, will prevent most cases. This is all a backdrop to my wedding planning, which we did at a local shrine. And every time we visited, they brought us something to drink. They had a little like kind of menu on a piece of plastic that had like, coffee, tea, and a couple other options, orange juice. Water was not included on this menu, but I asked for it every time, and it became this kind of running joke. Oh, Daniel's here. Would you like some water? And so I would kind of became the water boy. And so the day of our wedding, I asked for water, and I was brought, a very small little glass, and I thought I had drank enough, and I, wasn't thinking too much about it. Didn't have any caffeine at all. But I was dressed up in a hakama, and, we got really lucky with the weather. The weather was clear. One of the few days it was a big rainy stretch for about a week and a half, and it was very cold. But our day of the wedding was clear and relatively warm. And maybe because of all that, because I was in this hakama getup, literally right as I reached for the ceremonial cup of sake that you drink, as I stood from a seated position to do that, and that's often I find when I make a sudden movement or something like that, I'll go into this rhythm. I went into the SVT rhythm, which was, it was so frustrating. So for those who haven't been to one, we had a shinzenshiki, I think that's what it's called, type of wedding, which is, it literally means a ceremony before God, kami, right? And shinzen, not shinzen as in nature. And one of the parts of the ceremony is to strengthen your bond with your partner by drinking from ceremonial cups. And I'd been sitting down, and I stood to accept this cup, and I felt myself lose my breath just momentarily, and my heart skipped a beat, and then went into this rapid rhythm. And I was like, crap. This was like the worst timing. This is kind of a moment where you're supposed to be present with those around you, with your partner. And suddenly I'm trapped in my own body with this heart that won't stop beating. And I can only think of one thing, which is like, okay, how can I stop this? I tried bearing down a couple of times with no success. I couldn't very well splash water on my face or lie down and put my feet up. So I had to just kind of keep going through it, especially because I still had to read out the vows, which I did with this crazy heart rate. Read out the vows. And at some point I turned to my wife and I let her know what was happening. And so she knows about what I was going through, and that she's seen me go through it a couple times. So when I mentioned it, she knew exactly what had happened. And after I got through the vows, I kind of caught the eye of our helper, who was with us all day to kind of walk us through the ceremony. And she was wonderful and also spoke English, so she was able to help my family during the ceremony. She was kind of calling out what to do, standing, bowing, things like that. And right as I caught her eye, she kind of went to strong arm my friend's wife and their crying toddler out of the shrine. The toddler had been kind of like starting to cry off and on, and maybe he's stopping. And then she kind of like didn't really give my friend's wife the option of staying and kind of forced her out, which we all laughed about afterwards. It was very funny. And I enjoyed it. It was fun to have that kind of memorable moment in our ceremony. And when she came back into the shrine at the back, I kind of turned and caught her eye again, and she came over right behind me. I said I needed water, and she was shocked. She was like, no, you have to wait. No, not right now. I can't remember exactly what she said, but it was something like that. And it was very shocked. Fortunately, my wife was able to kind of turn and say something as well and clarify that no, this is like some kind of medical situation. And so they managed to get me a glass of water, which I hilariously chugged down in one. And it was a nice big glass, no ice, just cold water, which is perfect. It didn't really subside though. So after that ceremony, the ceremony finished. It was still going through the rhythm. After that, we walked to the main shrine for a very quick prayer there, and we were able to arrange for another glass of water just as we were entering the main shrine. And so sitting there in the shade of the main shrine, which was open and slightly cooler, open to the air, like any kind of main shrine you'd imagine at a medium-sized shrine in Japan, as opposed to the smaller shrine where we had the core of the ceremony, which was kind of in the back and closed off and warmer. My body was finally able to kind of like rehydrate and cool down, and we were seated, resting on the tatami, and finally went back into regular rhythm, which was a huge relief. And so I guess the lesson here, which I've talked about this before, is that you need to know when and how to rock the boat. And this is not necessarily unique to Japan, but I think it is helpful in Japan. Generally, you are not supposed to eat or drink in the shrine during a ceremony. And I probably could have like soldiered through this. I probably could have just waited until the end and then like waited even until after like more pictures, and then we had a little private moment and then put my feet up. But this was also not a medical emergency of a kind. And I felt kind of comfortable enough in my own skin making this kind of faux pas. I didn't really care what the shrine employees thought. I didn't really care what our helper thought or what friends and family thought. I kind of knew they would like just like forgive it and not think too deeply about it. I just needed to like rehydrate at that moment. And this, I think, is an important place to get to with yourself wherever you happen to be, whether it's Japan, United States, Europe, anywhere. Maybe particularly so in Japan, I'll admit. So much of the messaging about Japan, in Japan, you receive as a beginner to the language or to the culture or as a first-time visitor to the country, is that Japan and Japanese culture and Japanese people value order and obedience. And I know for me in particular, on my first few visits to Japan, the first few years kind of learning Japanese resulted in a lot of awkward, like kind of overcompensation, trying not to make waves, trying purposefully to not stand out. And the story I always tell is how I was when I got to the JET program the first winter. I got terribly sick with pneumonia. I was battling this terrible fever. I would take Advil, and my fever would go down just enough I would feel better. And then, sure enough, 3-4 hours later, I would just feel terrible again. And I took a couple days off work and just stayed home and tried to rest and didn't really do anything, didn't want to bother anyone, didn't want to, inconvenience my supervisor. And then after like 4 days of that, I was like, something is really wrong here. I need to like say, hey, how do I go to the clinic? Can you help me go to the clinic? And I ended up finally asking my supervisor to help me out and take me to the clinic. Now I probably would just go myself, and that's what I do. Like, you don't need somebody's permission. You don't need to ask somebody to go to the doctor in Japan. You just need to Google it and do it. If you can't do the language, then that's when it becomes a little bit of an issue. But setting up things like that, doing that kind of work in advance can be good, I think. But troubling somebody when you need that medical attention, super important, I think, even in Japan, other places as well. But being in your own, comfortable enough with yourself to inconvenience somebody, I think, to make a faux pas, to make ways if you need to. It's a bit of a skill in its own right, definitely in Japan, but also all over the world. So something to think about, I think, something to be mindful of as you're spending time in Japan. And that's just about it. That's just about all I've got for you this month. The Iro Iro I have is just one link that I found that was interesting, which was an oral history of the NBA's COVID-19 shutdown, which was a super interesting read. Highly recommend reading that. It brought back some pretty vivid memories of the early shutdown days, which is wild to think about that it's 5 years ago. And I always said from the very beginning that COVID felt like a 5-year issue, and it's basically has been, it's still ongoing, but it does feel like things are more or less back to normal. Forever changed, obviously, but back to a sort of normality. And was very interesting to read that, see how the NBA handled it pretty well, all things considered, maybe. And think about those early days of the pandemic where the basketball game happened on a Wednesday. Thursday was my last day in the office because on Fridays I worked from home that Friday, and then didn't go back into the office until I quit, really, to be honest. I think the next summer in 2021, we were starting to go back a little bit, and I was going back into the office just to kind of wrap things up. So give that a read, and we'll see you here next month in April. Enjoy the Hanami coming up. I'll be doing some in Kyoto for a couple weekends. I'm looking forward to that, and fingers crossed for good weather for everyone. So have a great month, and we'll see you soon.